Hello and welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. I'm going through a series of the evidence on the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. If you have found value in my work that you've seen here on my YouTube channel, please consider supporting my ministry through purchasing my published work, a commentary on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. You can find it where books are sold. Zulon Press is the publisher. It's available on Amazon and elsewhere. The content for these presentations primarily comes from Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's the chapter entitled Support of Deity, the Resurrection, Hoax or History. I hope to incorporate content from Frank Turek and Norm Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Look out for that in future presentations, although I anticipate that much of the content that will be covered in that book will have already been addressed in previous videos from McDowell's book. Okay, so first we're going to discuss how Jesus was alive as his appearances demonstrated. We're going to talk about the importance of his appearances. C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, spoke of the importance of Christ's post-resurrection appearances. He says, the first fact in the history of Christendom is a number of people who say they've seen the resurrection. If they died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no gospels would have ever been written. We've sort of discussed that in previous videos, how if there was no empty tomb, if his body was still there, there was no message. And likewise, if there's no post-resurrection appearances, there's no gospel message. J.P. Moreland, in Scaling the Secular City, says, finally, the resurrection appearances are reported with extreme reserve. When one compares them with the reports in the apocryphal Gospels, which were written in the 2nd century and later, the difference is startling. In the Apocrypha, detailed explanations are given about how the resurrection took place. Gross details are added. For example, the Gospel of Peter, which was written in the mid-2nd century, reports a cross coming out of the tomb after Jesus, and Jesus is so tall he extends above the clouds. So they become a little bit more just outrageous in these mid-2nd century sources. William Lane Craig, great apologist. I hope to incorporate content from some of his work a little bit at another time. Reasonable Faith, I believe, is the name of one of his books, one I want to work with in future content. Anyway, Craig says, since the apostles were guardians of the Jesus tradition and directed the Christian community, it would have been difficult for fictitious appearance stories, incompatible with the apostles' own experience, to arise and flourish so long as they were alive. Discrepancies in secondary details could exist, and the theologies of the evangelists could affect the traditions, but the basic traditions themselves could not have been legendary. The substantially unhistorical accounts of Jesus did not rise until the 2nd century, and even then they were universally rejected by the church. So the apostles would have been able to, while they were still living, they would have been able to say, hey, this post-resurrection appearance of Jesus that is going around, that's not true. Because I was actually there, this is what I actually saw. J.N.D. Anderson writes of the testimony of the appearances. The most drastic way of dismissing the evidence would be to say that these stories are mere fabrications, that they were pure lies. But so far as I know, not a single critic today would take such an attitude. In fact, it would be really an impossible position. Think of the number of witnesses, over 500. Think of the character of the witnesses, men and women who gave the world the highest ethical teaching it has ever known, and who even on the testimony of their enemies lived it out in their lives. Think of the psychological absurdity of picturing a little band of defeated cowards cowering in an upper room one day, and a few days later transformed into a company that no persecution could silence, and then attempting to attribute this dramatic change to nothing more than convincing a miserable fabrication they were trying to foist upon the world. That simply wouldn't make sense. So over 500 people who could then talk to other people who aren't in the 500, and they could say that they saw this risen Lord. They could repeat much of his teaching. They could live the Christian life out before unbelievers. They could die martyrs' deaths. And no matter how much vitriol and hatred was spewed out toward them because of this risen Lord that they had seen, they would go to their graves proclaiming his message. John Warwick Montgomery, in the History of Christianity, comments, "Note that when the disciples of Jesus proclaimed the resurrection, they did so as eyewitnesses, and they did so while people were still alive who had contact with the events they spoke of. In AD 56, Paul wrote that over 500 people had seen the risen Christ and that most of them were still alive. It passes the bounds of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might have easily refuted it by producing the body of Jesus." So Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians came early, and if there was evidence to contradict Paul, that Jesus had been witnessed by hundreds of people, it could have certainly been produced, and all these years later there would be no story of the resurrection because proof would have been provided right then, right there, that his body had been found, that the resurrection was false. But no such proof was given because the resurrection did really happen, and therefore the message still goes around to this day. You just have the skeptics who deny it. Bernard Ramm writes, "If there were not resurrection, it must be admitted by radical critics that Paul deceived the apostles of an actual appearance of Christ to him, and that they in turn deceived Paul about the appearances of a risen Christ to them." Right, so the apostles lied about seeing Christ, and Paul lied about seeing Christ, and they all lie to each other. How difficult it is to impugn the evidence of the epistles at this point when they have such strong validation as authentic. Bernard Ramm. So they're gonna agree with each other that Christ was really risen from the dead. J.P. Moreland on the nature of Jesus' resurrection body. First, the writers of the Gospels and Paul are agreed that Jesus appeared in bodily form. It should be granted that Jesus now had a spiritual body which was not entirely the same as his earthly body. But Jesus still had a spiritual body, and neither Paul nor the Gospel writers understand this to mean a purely spiritual being who can be seen only in the mind. This body could be seen and touched and had continuity with the body laid in the tomb. The risen Christ was capable of eating. Right, he was literally, bodily, physically raised from the dead. William Lane Craig. But while it's true that Paul teaches that our resurrection bodies will be modeled after Jesus' body and that they will be spiritual, it does not follow that these bodies will be non-physical. Such an interpretation is not supported by an exegesis of Paul's teaching. If by summa pneumaticon, spiritual body, one understands a body that is intangible, unextended, or immaterial, then it's false to assert that Paul taught that we still have that kind of resurrection body. New Testament commentators agree that pneumatikos means spiritual in the sense of orientation, not substance. The transformation of the earthly body to a soma pneumaticon, accordingly, does not rescue it from materiality, but from mortality. So this is a physical body. We're talking about this is a physical resurrection body. Craig continues, a body that is unextended and intangible would have been in a contradiction in terms for the apostle. The resurrection body will be an immortal, powerful, glorious, spirit-directed body suitable for inhabiting a renewed creation. All commentators agree that Paul did not teach the immortality of the soul alone, but his affirmation of the resurrection of the body becomes vacuous and indistinguishable from such a doctrine unless it means the tangible physical resurrection. The exegetical evidence does not, therefore, support a bifurcation between Paul and the evangelists with regard to the nature of the resurrection body. Next, we're going to talk about how the enemies of Christ did not refute the resurrection. Instead, they were silent about that. In Acts chapter 2, Luke records Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. There was no refutation given by the Jews to his bold proclamation of Christ's resurrection. Why? Because the evidence of the empty tomb was there for anyone to examine if they wanted to disclaim it. We talked about that a couple times in a previous video. However, everyone knew that the grave no longer held the body of Jesus Christ. That was a well-established fact, because at that time, with the events happening right there, right then, you could easily make a brief trip to the empty tomb and see that the body was not there. In Acts 25, we see Paul in prison in Caesarea. Festus, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Just what was it about Paul's gospel that so irritated the Jews? What point did they totally avoid in making their accusations? Festus, in explaining the case to King Agrippa, describes the central issue as concerning a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So the Jews could not explain the empty tomb. There was no way to explain it away. They had to make up stuff. They made all kinds of personal attacks on Paul, but avoided the objective evidence for the resurrection. They were reduced to subjective name-calling and avoided discussing the silent witness of the empty grave. The silence of the Jews speaks louder than the voice of Christians, or as FairBairn notes, the silence of the Jews is as significant as the speech of the Christians. Professor Day says, the simple disproof, the effective challenging of the fact of the resurrection would have dealt a death blow to Christianity, and they had every opportunity of disproof if it were possible. But it was not possible because the tomb was empty. Okay, Wolfhart Pannenberg, cited by J. and D. Anderson, says the early Jewish polemic against the Christian message about Jesus' resurrection, traces of which have already been left in the Gospels, does not offer any suggestion that Jesus' grave had remained untouched. The Jewish polemic would have had to have every interest in the preservation of such a report. However, quite to the contrary, it shared the conviction with its Christian opponents that Jesus' grave was empty. It limited itself to explaining the fact in its own way. So, yeah, again, the Jews had to come up with a different reason for why the tomb was empty, because there was no disputing that fact. John Stott, in his book Basic Christianity, the church was founded on the resurrection, and disproving it would have destroyed the whole Christian movement. However, instead of any disproof, throughout the first century, Christians were threatened, beaten, flogged, and killed because of their faith. It would have been much simpler to have silenced them by producing Jesus' body, but this was never done. As John Stott has well said, the silence of Christ's enemies is as eloquent a proof of the resurrection as the apostles' witness. Yes, if the disciples were so wrong, if the message was so inaccurate, just take Jesus' body out of the tomb and show it to everyone, and then the message can stop. But guess what? They couldn't, because his body was not there. He was not there. He was risen. Next, we're going to talk about how Christ's enemies gave no refutation of the resurrection. Instead, they mocked. When Paul spoke to the Athenians about Christ in Athens, they had no answer for his claims. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. That's from Acts 17, verse 32. They merely laughed it off, because they could not understand how a man could rise from the dead. They did not even attempt to defend their position. In essence, they said, Don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's already made up. Why did Paul encounter such unbelief in Greece and not in Jerusalem? Because while in Jerusalem, the fact of the empty tomb was indisputable, because it was right there for people to examine, as we've said. In Athens, the evidence was far away, so that the emptiness of the tomb was not common knowledge. They had to take people's word for it. Paul's hearers had not checked the story out for themselves, and rather than go to any trouble to investigate, they were satisfied to jest in ignorance. Intellectual suicide best describes their stand. Paul told Agrippa and Festus in Caesarea and everyone in the court that Christ would be the first to rise from the dead and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice in Acts 26, Festus said, Now, as he thus made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. But then Paul said, I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. For the king, before whom I also speak freely, knows these things, for I'm convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. Yeah, Paul was in danger before Agrippa when he's preaching the gospel to him. Again, just as in Athens, Paul met with unbelief. His message was that Christ was risen from the dead. And again, no evidence to the contrary was presented in rebuttal. They couldn't say, no, he wasn't risen from the dead. You're lying, Paul. Here's the proof. Here's his body. Instead, they made fun of Paul. Only vain mockery came from Festus. Paul's defense was uttered in the words of sober truth. Paul stressed the empirical nature of his case, saying this thing was not done in a corner. He challenged Agrippa and Festus with the evidence, but Festus, like the Athenians, only laughed it off. The incident took place in Caesarea, where it would not have been known by everyone that the tomb was empty. A trip to Jerusalem, however, would have confirmed the fact, as we've said. Just had to go see where the tomb was. You'd see that the tomb was empty. The empty tomb is established as a historical fact. The empty tomb, the silent testimony of the resurrection of Christ, has never been refuted. The Romans and Jews could not produce Christ's body or explain where it went. Nevertheless, they refused to believe. Men and women still reject the resurrection, not because of the insufficiency of the evidence, but in spite of its sufficiency. The evidence for the resurrection is sufficient. People just choose to reject it, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. Skeptics will say that there is no evidence. That is false. The evidence that is available does not meet their threshold for evidence. But just because it doesn't meet some of the skeptics' threshold for evidence does not mean that it's good evidence. Does not mean that it's not good evidence. It is good evidence. Just because evidence does not meet the threshold for some skeptics does not mean that the evidence that is available is not good evidence, because it is good evidence. I hope I said that right. E.H. Day writes, in that empty tomb, Christendom has always discerned an important witness to the reasonableness of belief. Christians have never doubted that, as a matter of fact, it was found empty on the third day. The gospel narratives agree in emphasizing it. The burden of proof rests upon those who lay hold on the tradition, but upon those who either deny that the tomb was found empty or explain the absence of the Lord's body by some rationalistic theory. There's always ways to explain away the empty tomb. But the Christians and people who believe the Bible have the written record to go by, and there's other lines of evidence too, and we've discussed some of those, and we will discuss some of those as videos like this continue to be made. Okay, James Denney, as cited by Wilbur Smith in his book, Smith's book Therefore Stands, says the empty grave is not the product of a naive apologetic spirit, a spirit not content with the evidence for the resurrection contained in the fact that the Lord had appeared to his own and had quickened them unto new victorious life. It is an original, independent, unmotivated part of the apostolic testimony. The apostles had seen the risen Christ. They had the post-resurrection appearances. That was something that was necessary for them to be apostles. Next, we're going to talk about the transformed lives of the disciples, and there are still transformed lives going on in people in every generation since the resurrection. John Stott says, perhaps the transformation of the disciples of Jesus is the greatest evidence of all for the resurrection. Simon Greenleaf, a Harvard attorney, says of the disciples, it was therefore impossible that they could have persisted in affirming the truths they have narrated had not Jesus actually risen from the dead. And had they not known this fact, as certainly as they knew any other fact, the annals of military warfare afford scarcely an example of the like historic constancy, patience, and unflinching courage. They had every possible motive to review carefully the grounds of their faith and the evidences of the great facts and truths which they asserted. Paul Little says, are these men who helped transform the moral structure of society consummate liars or deluded madmen? These alternatives are harder to believe than the fact of the resurrection, and there's no shred of evidence to support them that they are liars or deluded madmen. There's no evidence to support that they're liars or madmen. Josh McDowell, the author of the book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, says, "Look at the changed lives of James, the brother of Jesus. Before the resurrection, he despised all that his brother stood for. He thought Christ's claims were blatant pretension and served only to ruin the family name. After the resurrection, though, James is found with the other disciples preaching the gospel of their Lord. His epistle, the book of James, describes well the new relationship that he had with Christ. He describes himself as a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ in the first verse of his epistle. The only explanation for this change in James' life is that which Paul gives, that after Jesus' death, Jesus was seen by James." George Matheson says in his book, "The Representative Men of the New Testament," the skepticism of Thomas comes out in the belief that the death of Jesus would be the death of his kingdom. "Let us go that we may die with him." The man who uttered these words had, at the time when he uttered them, no hope in Christ's resurrection. No man would propose to die with another if he expected to see him again in a few hours. Thomas at that moment had given up all intellectual belief. He saw no chance for Jesus. He did not believe in his physical power. He had made up his mind that the forces of the outer world would be too strong for him, would crush him. Josh McDowell says, however, Jesus made himself known to Thomas also. The result was recorded in John's Gospel, where Thomas exclaimed, "My Lord and my God." Thomas made an about-face after seeing his Lord risen from the grave. He went on to die a martyr's death. In fact, I think all of the apostles died martyrs' deaths according to tradition, except for John. Next, we're going to talk about established psychological facts, the transformed lives through almost 2,000 years of church history. And that's the story of every true Christian, that God has transformed their life. In response to this line of evidence, I will hear a skeptic argue back that but a Muslim will have the same answer. They'll say God changed their lives too. The Muslim does not have eyewitness testimony from his disciples of having risen from the grave. Muhammad did not rise from the grave. Jesus rose from the grave 2,000 years ago, and we have the eyewitness accounts of that on which to base our faith. Just as Jesus Christ transformed the lives of his disciples, so the lives of men and women throughout the past 1,900 years have also been transformed. So the established psychological fact of changed lives, then, is a credible reason for believing in the resurrection. It's subjective evidence bearing witness to the objective fact that Jesus Christ arose on the third day. For only a risen Christ could have such transforming power in a person's life. That's right. People aren't going to be so committed to a cause if they know that the evidence for it isn't good, and all of the changed lives and the personal testimony stories of Jesus changing people from wicked, worldly, devilish people into still sinners, but saved by the grace of God, into God lovers instead of God haters. This is a strong piece of evidence for the historicity and the veracity of Christianity. Next time, we're going to talk about the institution of the Christian Church, the phenomenon of the Christian Sunday, the phenomena of Christian sacraments, and the historical phenomenon of the Church. Until then, thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.